Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. I have a lot to live up to, so I'm starting to get my own nerves considering the subject matter of today's lecture. So again, I'd like to thank you very much for welcoming me so warmly to UMBC. It's an honor to be invited to give this Robert K. Webb lecture and to help you all remember and honor this very important scholar in my field, scholar and educator. And again, those are not always one and the same things. So it's a real delight to be able to come here and to as I say, help you keep him on the map, so to speak, and keep British history very much on the map in an environment where British history is increasingly less kind of central or even recognized as a viable subject. But the way of keeping it fresh and keeping it relevant, even outside Britain, is to use new perspectives, apply new lenses, and take different methodological approaches. And hopefully, in what I'm going to be describing here today, that's exactly what I hope I'm doing, in ways that are possibly a little unpredictable and going slightly against the grain, not in an aggressive way, but just offering kind of options and creative ways of rethinking this period in British history. So let me try to do just that with you today. So the subject of my talk, of course, is historical and refers specifically to the profound effects of political events, mainly on ordinary people who did not wield political power. And as such, it is particularly timely. Often I find it is timely, this subject, but now more than ever. This autumn, of course, as you'd call it this fall, marks the 85th anniversary of the events to which I will be speaking about. And even more precisely and even more poignantly today is the 85th anniversary of the November pogrom, more often referred to in common parlance as Kristallnacht. Now, these events and their repercussions have taken on renewed relevance. In these past weeks, they have been cited as painful reference points for current events, making this anniversary all that more apposite. Now through the time machine, and let's go back to the late 1930s and see where these parallels can or should be drawn. As contemporaries noted, the long months from the Munich crisis, so the autumn of 1938, September 1938 to be more precise, through to the end of the so-called phony war, so that's the spring of 1940, felt like a war of nerves in Britain. The battlefields were psychological and imagined as much as they were physical and material. Now, turning to sources that reveal experience, we can explore the internal and internalized history of this international crisis. So please join me in listening to writers, politicians, academics, anthropological researchers, psychiatrists, and advertisers, as one after the other projected this overwhelming nervous disorder onto bodies and onto the body politic. Together, these bodies of evidence of bodily experience ultimately makes a case for reframing and renaming this period. Being attuned, therefore, to emotional and psychological cycles and to psychological milestones, and less reliant, therefore, on political chronologies, I will argue that we should identify the first battle of the so-called British People's War as the War of Nerves. So the mythological and rhetorical power of calling Britain's war effort between 1939 and 1945 the People's War originated during the war itself. And it has been perpetuated and in turn debunked by generations since. I too will ultimately be questioning this seductive construction, this seductive articulation of the war on the British home front. As generally speaking, I'm going to join with other historians, but in slightly different ways, in questioning and problematizing that myth of unity, of consensus building, of keeping calm while carrying on, which of course is now a very cliched but important slogan from those early years of the war. Now, in his largely forgotten but no less important, Journal Under the Terror, 1938. Bloomsburyite, prolific man of letters, Cambridge literary scholar and classicist, and crisis diarist, F.L. Lucas, or Peter Lucas as he was called, or as he liked to be called. He emerges as a perspicacious narrator of this war of nerves. He was both witness and victim of a world he described as filled with nervous breakdowns. Lucas captured a distinctive sense of bewilderment in the autumn of 1938. As he put it, the crisis seems to have filled the world with nervous breakdowns. Or perhaps the crisis itself was only one more nervous breakdown of a world driven by the killing pace of modern life and competition into ever acuter neurasthenia. So how did it feel to live through the Munich crisis, this war of nerves? Again, the emphasis here is how we can try to retrieve, reconnect, relate to the feeling of living through this moment in time. Tragically, and I won't go into much detail here, but I'm also, of course, interested in how it felt to want to die because of the oppressive war of fear and due to spiraling levels of collective and personal anxiety. Private and individual experience mirrored the collective and public one. And as another Bloomsburyite, a much more prominent one, and feminist writer, Virginia Woolf mused in mid-September 1938, odd, this new public anxiety, how it compares with private, how it blinds. The next day, she confessed that it's a hopeless war, this, when we know winning means nothing, so we're committed for the rest of our lives to public misery. This will be slashed with private, too. A couple of days later, Woolf diagnosed, just as in violent personal anxiety, the public lapses into complete indifference. One can feel no more at the moment, revealing the extent of her emotional exhaustion and the apathy that many people experienced, clearly as a defense mechanism against everything that was going on. Now, I've chosen a Canadian magazine to give recognition to our origins, me and Dan. And here we go. This term, the war of nerves, becomes incredibly prominent at this moment. It becomes one of the dominant tropes to emerge both in the discursive framing and in the lived experience of the suspenseful and anxious failure of the piece. This was a war of nerves. It was understood in psychological and physical, diplomatic and military, and metaphoric and imagistic terms. This was fundamentally a different kind of warfare. Never before has there been a war of nerves such as this, not bullets only, nor artillery, nor bayonets, nor bombs dropping from the sky or the modern armory, but threats of mysterious weapons, gigantic bluff, and a cat-and-mouse game intended to stampede the civilian population of this island into terror. According to the practical psychologist, this was how he described himself, or how he identified his professional standing, Ernest Hunt, Hitler's war of nerves is like no other war that the world has yet seen, because it is being waged, as it were, simultaneously upon two battlefields, the mental and the physical. John Langdon Davis titled his pamphlet outlining what needed to be done to better prepare for the war, Nerves versus Nazis. This came out in 1940. This whimsical title is really the best thing about this otherwise really quite dry and alarmist text about war preparation and the lack of preparedness. So by reflecting on these bodies of evidence and evidence of embodiment, I wish to contest and disrupt the traditional chronological markers of the accelerating international crisis and the descent into war in Britain. So from the summer, as I've said, of 1938 to the spring of 1940. Historians have consistently moved around the bookends of historical periods to offer fresh retellings of seemingly fixed and notionally familiar national narratives and collective myths about the nation. The default chronological structures for the first half of the 20th century, of course, is the two world wars, with the interwar period further subdivided by the Great Depression. Modernization, democratization, and secularization are implied by the infrequency of identifying the eras of the 20th century by the reigning monarch, in the British case. In scholarship, as in popular culture, the 20s has been variously encapsulated as the Roaring 20s, the Jazz Age, the Age of the Flapper. The global consequences of the Wall Street crash undermined the alleged social optimism, cultural innovation, personal frivolity, and the promise of political and diplomatic post-war reconstruction. There was a sudden slide, let's say, into the hungry 30s, the Devil's Decade. I'm citing here famous titles of, that try to provide some kind of compendium of the 1930s. The Long Weekend is the title that Robert Graves and working with social historian Alan Hodge gave to his book. And even just the title, The 30s, which was Malcolm Muggeridge's book, as well as a later book by Juliet Gardner, seems to be enough to evoke a state of socioeconomic misery, perpetual crisis, and the kind of the violent, passionate political polarization of that era. So with a dizzying mix of, I guess, nostalgia, disgust, and condescension, in his volume-length eulogy of the decade that had just come to a close, the 30s, published in 1940, Malcolm Muggeridge put it this way. He recognized how men aim at projecting their own inward unease onto as large a screen as possible. He opened his panoramic chronicles of the decade by reminding readers how one of the few constants in life is a sense of crisis, while admitting how the decade just ended may legitimately be regarded as unusually eventful. Now, as a unit, the years between the two world wars have been characterized, of course, also as the interwar crisis, the failure of political extremism, which speaks much to our shared interests. And I think most evocatively and most relevant to the points I'm trying to make here as the so-called the morbid age. And I'm referring here to, I think, Richard Overy's quite majestic and monumental work of synthesis and cultural meaning. Now, sequestering the political and diplomatic events of the late 1930s, the most commonly used collective epithets are the international crisis, the climax of which was the September crisis, the Munich crisis, or the 4 days of crisis. And again, it's important to remember how packed these events were and how between the 25th of September and the 29th of September 1938, the world kind of sat on the edge of their seat waiting to find out what was going to happen. Was it going to be peace or war? Broadly, this is also often described as the age of appeasement or the countdown to war. For generations that lived through it, to speak succinctly of the crisis was immediately recognized as the Munich crisis. I guess the same way when we mention the war, to bring a little Faulty Towers into that, it still suffices to say the war, and kind of most people of still my generation, and certainly older people will immediately know that we're referencing 39 to 45. The same was true when people said the crisis. Everyone could situate where they were then, how that crisis, how those really suspenseful days affected them. The Second World War, of course, is also chapterized from the British declaration of war against Germany on the 3rd of September 39 to the fall of France and Holland, Dunkirk, then the Blitz. These months became known as the Phony War or the Boer War, B-O-R-E, Boring War. For those who aren't familiar with that. Because not much really happened, certainly on the home front in those months. In medias res of the international crisis, Winston Churchill, never a lecture on British history without some mention of Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, I think helpfully, as a great rhetorician, a great wordsmith, he called this phase the bloodless war, which says much the same thing. Churchill also used the expression, just to throw that in, the war of nerves, to describe the Nazi attempt to wear down the British and the French democracies. Now, it bears emphasizing that the dramatic unfolding of the Sudeten crisis, the signing of both the Four Powers Agreement and the Anglo-German Declaration in Munich on the 30th of September 1938 was all engrossing, irrespective of class, generation, gender, region, ethnicity, or political influence, or proximity to political influence. Every aspect of the crisis dominated the news disseminated by the press, by the radio, by the newsreels, intruding into every facet of people's lives and to their consciousness. The newspapers published fever charts, and I think this is quite a helpful source to illustrate this. These fever charts claimed to measure surges in public feeling. National and provincial papers covered the foreign news extensively and in ways accessible to their respective demographic of readers, while simultaneously being an important outlet to communicate vital public service information about distribution of gas masks, preparation for evacuation, ARP, which is air raid precaution drills, enlistment and voluntary work, and warnings about hoardings and about what we would now call antisocial behavior. But interestingly, possibly not surprisingly, the consistent message in all these forms of media was that the public needed to stay calm, that hysterical behavior, losing one's cool, was typical of foreigners and not of the British. The social research organization that described its work as the anthropology of ourselves, mass observation, was out in force to capture the reaction of the man on the street. MO, mass observation, volunteers were busier than ever writing up their directive replies. Together, all this evidence generated by the Mass Observation Project was published within months by Tom Harrison and Charles Madge as Britain by Mass Observation. And the first big, more than half of the book is all about the crisis itself. And it's often been kind of ignored and overlooked by historians of appeasement, which is nonsensical to me. But I've done my best to bring this back as a completely relevant source for rethinking, at least, appeasement from the perspective of the people. Similarly, private diaries kept by well-known and anonymous alike were saturated by feelings about the hyperactive news cycle, confessing relief or shame, admiration or rage, and hope or dejection, and most interestingly, often a confusing mix of all of those things. Bewilderment is often possibly the best kind of catch-all term for that kind of emotional turmoil, that up and down, that inability to even stop to think about how one felt. So not quite there yet. Encouragingly, the different turns in historical scholarship, culture, gender, transnationalism, material and emotional approaches have directed us to new evidence and long suppressed, or maybe it's more apt in this regard to say long repressed vantage points. Indeed, the close study of public opinion and appeasement has already done some work in pulling the scholarship out of those kind of familiar ruts of great man, guilty man thinking about who was responsible, who should, the blame game around Britain's policy of appeasement. This has left the way open, I think, for different kinds of inquiries, not only about public opinion, but importantly about private opinion and intimate experience during the Munich crisis. So there's a deep and intimate history, an internal and internalized history of international relations, which I'm trying to tell here. And building on a rich seam of scholarship that has unearthed the war inside from 39 to 45, the so-called domestic angst of the home front, and the pathologization of the public sphere, I think it's high time that we consider the crisis inside and the interior history of the arguably more tense, anxious, and unpredictable pre-war years. So that brings me to Lucas, and much of the center section of the lecture will be about Lucas. How can we then access and record the tangible and material, the ethereal and emotional, and the psychological and visceral experience of the international crisis? In fact, Peter Lucas anticipated the interest that historians of the future would have, or rather should have, in this kind of intuitive and cognitive aspects of the political crisis. His journal Under the Terror, 1938, that's the title with the date there, in which he undertook to keep a diary from the 31st of December, 1937 for 1 year, always intended to be published, provided an answer to the question he wanted future historians to ask. And that was this question: what can it have felt like, he said, to live in that strange, tormented, and demented world? His diary, therefore, I think offers an emotionally expressive and expansive personal narrative. Deliberately and self-consciously amassed, it stands as an affective archive of the crisis. A classical scholar himself, Lucas dearly wished that some Roman of the crumbling empire of Honorius and Valentinian had done so much for me, while he too watched the tides of barbarism lap higher and higher against the dikes of the civilized world. He's nothing if not verbose, I should say. Nonetheless, throughout this contrived public-facing diary form, and that is something obviously that strikes us immediately, nonetheless, Lucas is acutely aware that he's writing a history from the point of view of his present and employing, and he uses the current Freudian terminology in which he's well-versed. He ponders, what will historians make of this England of 1938 that, grown old in empire, we had a secret death wish and longed unconsciously to perish? Since at least there is peace in the grave. So the morbid age, indeed. Now, the dominant emotions he experiences during the course of the year of hastening terror are, and I'm using his own words, impotent rage. Rage, guilt, and sleeplessness with dismay and shame. Psychic disturbances and interrupted sleep. Cynicism and fatalism. And the descent into this kind of circumstantially triggered mental illness. The title itself, Journal Under the Terror, speaks to that vicarious British experience of fascism. As Lucas and his contemporaries, of course, are not victim in any corporeal sense of the terror in Spain, in Germany, in Abyssinia, in Austria, or in Czechoslovakia. This terror is at one remove, isn't it? Nonetheless, it is internalized. At the beginning of September, he tries to diagnose the nervous rhythm of the crisis in physical terms. He remarks on the seemingly contradictory responses of dread and excitement. It is partly, I think, that a sense of crisis must make one's glands respond by pouring energizers like adrenaline into one's blood, but partly, too, that one fears a peace fouler and more fatal even than war. A few days later, on the 4th of September, Lucas ponders the curious psychological effects of prolonged crisis, as he puts it himself. The political crisis in which Europe lets itself be kept on tenterhooks by one neurotic, he says, dominates both his conscious and subconscious thought. And he records that in the morning, when physically fresh, I feel a robust fatalism. In the afternoon, reading my regular 6 newspapers, growing rage and dread. In the small hours, I wake as oppressed as if I had a sack of concrete on my chest. Bed, indeed, is always bad for my morale. Lying on one's back, one feels mentally also as helpless as an overturned tortoise. And that's a very powerful image that he uses on many occasions. Indeed, when I interviewed his son, he referred to that image, that his father said that a lot about his sense of helplessness in many different kind of situations. And it's obviously a very powerful and relatable image. As is everything he's saying, you know, he's kind of like the doom scroller of his time, right? It would be little wonder if readers, therefore, hear echoes in Lucas's psychological and nervous state and detect emotional parallels between then and our present of polycrisis or permacrisis. Indeed, it's because of these echoes and these deep resonances that I've been working with the playwright Nicola Baldwin on the adaptation and the dramatization of his diaries into a play called The Nervous State. I spoke a bit about that yesterday to a few students, a few very brilliant students. I won't have time to speak about it now, but I just thought I'd flag that and put it there for a moment. Nonetheless, at every turn in this gripping September crisis, Lucas documents the psychological, the psychomedical effects. Nausea, depression, the sickening feeling provoked by a fear of war on civilians. Listening to the radio on the 30th of September and feeling physically sick, he says. Lucas does, however, experience unexpected symptoms, offering as a self-assessment that the crisis must have somehow stimulated my adrenal glands to pour extra adrenaline into my blood or something. For never have I felt fuller of energy and a desperate gaiety than through these gloomy weeks. So he's full of contradictions and paradoxes here. This state of mind militates against waking in the morning with a dull sense of something wrong, as he puts it. And one drowsily asks oneself, what is it? And remembers, Europe. Now this madness is collective, sorry, that's from there as well, and Lucas speaks of a world threatened with an epidemic of nervous breakdowns and the general spread of neuroticism. Susan Kingsley Kent's compelling alternative periodization in her study, Aftershocks, Politics and Trauma in Britain, 1918 to 1931, she finishes it in 1931, I think could be easily extended, and I would welcome it to be extended to 1939, 38, 39. Lucas is very receptive to psychohistory as a means of answering the questions as he sees it that Marxist economics cannot. Thinking of ways in which to chart more fundamental fluctuations in the general mentality by epidemics of neurasthenia, as he puts it. He's engrossed in the contemplation of his own mortality and fully aware that under terror, suicide, deemed a morally and psychologically and psychically legitimate way out, is on everyone's mind. As he puts it, heaven knows modern Europe is no place to live without a safety exit. I often think it not the least of the virtues of a car that the fumes of its exhaust will convey one so smoothly down the shores of the Styx. Morbid, he says, he asks, but this is what a good many of us were thinking in 1938. There he, of course, splices together his classical, images that come always to him with the very epitome of the modern world and the car. Now, to corroborate Overy's sweeping overview of the period, this is the morbid age indeed, and suicide, actual and figurative, is particularly revealing of the individuated expressions of and pathological responses to the international crisis. But there's something very interesting about Lucas beyond his poetic ruminations. Because for Lucas, 1938 is also a personal annus horribilis. The collective descent into madness coincides with Lucas's second wife, Prudy or Prudence, and her mental breakdown. His diaries records his steady immersion into fatalism and his feeling that talk of old age in 1938 is indeed meeting trouble halfway. Who knows if the world will last 3 years? While he watches his wife suffer a serious mental breakdown with the implications that external factors have been a trigger. Indeed, Prudy is unable to attend the opening night of his play, The Lovers of Gudrun. He's a great lover of Scandinavian literature and mythology. And this play, quite painful in many ways as a play, but in any case, it premieres at the Stockport Garrick, which isn't far from where I live, which is a nice little added touch. And Prudy had designed the set for this play, but she can't attend. She's already hospitalized. She's already been institutionalized. Incidentally, the first night of the play is, well, tomorrow, 85 years ago, and Kristallnacht. So again, interesting how these events collide. And this is where he says, at that moment, this is where he writes, the crisis seems to have filled the world with nervous breakdowns. He notes before revealing that now it has happened at my own hearth. Nothing ghastlier than to see the person one has known best in the world for 7 years turn into an unknown who no longer knows herself. He protects his wife's privacy to an extent. He never identifies her in the journal as anything other than P. She's only mentioned 3 or 4 times. He offers very little character description, but at this point, her existence, the impact she has on his life, it must intrude into the diary. Indeed, what Lucas is usually documenting is his own response to her declining mental health. He is wretched, numbed, paralyzed with depression, as he puts it, as he tries to care for her. He now has real insight into Shakespeare's tragic heroines, into Ophelia and Macbeth, he says. Prudence's breakdown will eventually lead to the breakdown of their marriage. They'll be divorced within a year. And that's foreshadowed in his diary entry of the 14th of November, where he says, the horror of nervous breakdowns is the way in which the person dearest hitherto becomes the most hateful of this new personality, this changeling, this sick usurper that has become dictator in the stricken brain. Prudence's mental crisis inevitably sidetracks his diary project as the illness of someone one loves blots out the universe, he says. Now, his experience of living through and alongside mental illness will change the way that Lucas understands history and historical forces. He turns to the work of the Austrian psychoanalyst Wilhelm Stekel, who incidentally has recently arrived as a refugee. And he concludes that the fundamental evil of the world today does not lie in economic or political problems. The evil lies in the human brain, not merely in its stupidity, still more in its neuroses, its sadism and masochism, its possessiveness and aggressiveness, its endless phobias. Now, Lucas's diary consists of repeated ruminations on his war service and the formative experience of the missing generation. But he could not countenance pacifism. So if we want to see where he situates himself politically, this is what this helps us understand. He is a militant anti-fascist with near certainty that war is coming and that it is justified, that it is inevitable. This is a pattern quite out of sync with many in his generation who have had the similar experience. And yet for a pregnant moment, that being said, for a pregnant moment he finds himself reassessing his firm anti-appeasement stance, his activist anti-fascism, because of the personal experience, because of his experience in his marriage. Finding himself thinking, as he put it, God, if there's a war, it will wreck Prudence's treatment. The crisis of last September was nothing to this. Okay, so we see again how these two, the personal and the political, militate against each other. Lucas's year-long diary project ends in a very different place from where it began. That was not merely because of the ever acuter political crisis, which he could have foreseen and obviously did foresee in the very act and the very project of writing this journal. But it is due to his personal unhappiness and the calamity of his wife's mental illness. Now, I have so far offered a forensic reading of Peter and Prudence's conditions brought on by this war of nerves. But this experience was in no way unique. And the effect of the crisis on the mind was, well, on everyone's mind, to put it that way. This was a war of nerves on multiple levels: diplomatic, morale, private, and even commercial. The strategizing, trickery, and the behavior under pressure of politicians, diplomats, and propaganda chief was likened to an agonizing waiting game, a high-stakes card game, and the gambling with the fate of the peoples of Europe. Hitler's and Goebbels's modern techniques of psychological warfare, of wearing down the enemy by keeping them guessing about their next belligerent move, was termed this war of nerves. By the spring of 1939, the war of nerves was specifically applied to the free city of Danzig as the Nazis demanded its incorporation into the Reich. Anthony Eden, head of the so-called Glamour Boys, he had resigned, he was an anti-Chamberlainite. He used the term in a letter to his constituents at the beginning of August 1939 as he braced his constituents for war, while still holding out hope for peace, convinced that the rulers and peoples of Germany and Italy are firm in their determination to avoid war. Nonetheless, many chroniclers of the history, of the emotional history of the crisis remarked on temporal acceleration, the way in which time had sped up and was veering out of control. And the journalist Douglas Reed, too, remarked that we crowd into a few weeks in this helter-skelter age the experiences and emotions of a normal lifetime. So again, that compression of time, that emotional compression. There were just as many signs of the fraying of nerves, countless cases of the so-called jitters, and concerns about the threat to British resolve posed by jitterbugs, as they were called. Advertisers and anti-appeasers alike found the analogy highly profitable, both in commercial as well as in narrative terms. For instance, the brain tonic and the nerve revitalizer Sanatogen came up with the slogan that imbibing their product was how to win your war of nerves. And ran a whole campaign in 1938 to 1940 with that slogan. A similar product, Cheshire's Adult Nerve Tonic, was advertised with the slogan, "War nerves can be prevented. Get a bottle today and build your nerves up to meet the strain." Again, probably not so surprising the way of medical and pharmaceutical advertising that is so common now. But at that time, I guess that's the origin of it, if we think about it that way. Indeed, one could not fail to notice the increase in nerve cure advertisements that this pre-war period brought out. While men too suffered from crisis-triggered anxiety, cures for nervous debilities predominantly targeted, probably you won't be surprised to hear, women consumers, consistent with a newly diagnosed condition of suburban neurosis, which was suffered by housewives. All the remedies on the market to treat socially and environmentally caused conditions like neurasthenia, stomach acid upset or stomach reflux, and cases of the nerves offer us, I think, a social etiology of the war of nerves. And the Munich crisis was just that. It was a national crisis. It was a crisis of the nation, of its citizens. In Britain by mass observation, which I've cited earlier, Harrison and Madge were trying to define what crisis meant, its etymology, as well as its psychological symptoms. Mass observation considered it their brief to follow the contest of the war of nerves. They diagnosed an increasing occurrence of crisis fatigue, fatalism, apathy in response to the sense of continuous crisis, as well as a surge in suicide talk. That they interpreted as the last stage in the collapse of belief in any future. One mass observer, in this case male, identified as male, age 25, working as a local government officer, documented these reactions on the 28th of September 1938. And I just draw out some of this rather than read the whole thing. On the way to work this morning, I made a particular point of noting the attitude of people to the crisis. There was a terrible feeling of uneasiness, and the majority of people appeared to be anxious to discuss events and hear another's opinion. This feeling of unrest remained throughout the day. Another clerk said, "Frankly, I'm scared. I hardly know what to think. War cannot come. We can't stand it. I think we shall have to find a way out." So to conclude, the profound emotional impact, the psychological consequences, both personal and universal, and the repeated discursive markers of nervous disorder and a war of nerves, I think are really striking in the context of this period. A liminal space between, as George Orwell put it, the peace that is not peace that slumps into the war that is not war. Starting with the Munich crisis, the long months of extreme apprehension and the longer months from crisis through to the close of the phony war were most vividly described as the war of nerves. And I like this formulation just as much, that fear-haunted twilight zone between war and peace. So what then is the advantage and the purpose of giving voice to these psychological, psychiatric casualties of the late 1930s? I think the purpose of this is that rescuing the experience of those most deeply affected by the war of nerves allows for the elucidation of the relationship between bodily and national crisis in this morbid age. Ultimately, I hope it enriches our understanding of the mental landscape and the impact of two world wars on society, but also, of course, on the self in modern Britain. So thank you.
Professor Gottlieb has kindly agreed to answer questions, so if you have any, please.
Do you want to chair or?
No, you.
Okay.
Hi.
It's your show.
Thank you.
I am focusing on the part about mass observation. Was there any sense of "don't look at me," like that people were experiencing in addition to all of the nerves that they had about what the future held?
That sense of intrusion, you mean?
Yeah, if people are talking about what they're observing on the streets, is there a concern that, oh, I don't want to be observed?
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really great question. And indeed, one of the nicknames, mass observation is very new. It's established at the beginning of 1937. It's established almost to the day of the establishment of BIPO, or British Institute for Public Opinion, the Gallup polls, the importation of Gallup. Both start at the very beginning of 1937. And there's a lot of skepticism, a lot of uncertainty in British politics and political culture about these two new techniques. They're similar but very different at the same time. And mass observation gets quickly nicknamed mass eavesdropping. So I think that answers your question. There is a sense of, and maybe that's partially a kind of a British thing, and it reflects something about the kind of emotional culture and emotional community and the emotional kind of economy of British kind of self-awareness or identity, that you remain the importance of privacy, the importance of not being part of a collective, but having that kind of individuality and that privacy. So there are some reactions that way. But I think that again, I hope you noticed that Britain by Mass Observation is published, again, by a very iconic design by Penguin. It's a Penguin special. So it's definitely directed to a wide general audience, a reading public. It's a pocket book. It's published very quickly. All of the the data is collected and then analyzed by the core team, and it's out by January 1939. Okay, so it takes within months. It's on the bookstands. Academics, pay heed. That's how to do it. So I think in that sense there is a real hunger. There's on the part of mass observation, the whole project really is about empowering the public, giving voice to the public, going against, it's a fundamentally anti-fascist project. Yeah, but on the other hand, there are, and it's interested, it's very class, class bound. It's mainly middle class and well-educated people doing the observing of the working class. Their first kind of case study or, database, and I mean that in geographical terms, is Bolton, which they nickname Worktown. So it's about trying to, empower, but also kind of, apply anthropological methods as you would to the savages of other continents to our own people. But of course, that creates there's an obvious kind of privileging there and an elitism that's kind of inbound there. But the intentions are good, I think is what to say. And people don't have to. Some people who are observed. So they have a number of techniques. So one is kind of to conduct straw polls, but the other is to do that mass eavesdropping. So mass observers who are volunteers, they're not paid, they'll sit on a bus, they'll sit in a pub, they'll sit in the cinemas, and they'll jot down what people have said, and not only like what they've said more or less, but they try to get the language, the expressions, the local dialects. They try to create this archive of everyday life. So a long answer to your really good question.
Do you know if there was any social pushback to the commercialization of the sort of mental health crisis that was going on? Because that struck a chord really in me, and that is, I feel like, pure evil. To capitalize,
Yeah, capitalize exactly the word.
To capitalize on just such a mass crisis, and I think kind of connecting it to today, there are a lot of, I feel like, bogus mental health apps that are doing the same thing now and are charging exorbitant fees just to tell you that you're sad.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if there was any social pushback at all to that.
Yeah,
kind of thing.
it's a really good question. I don't know if I have the answer to it. I think it's so much in its infancy. I mean, of course, this is the mainstreaming of the discourse and the public understanding of conditions like shell shock, most obviously. And I think what I do find striking is, and the point that I want to make is that, I know we can be cynical about, this kind of, capitalization, this commercialization of people's misery. But at the same time, I think it did provide a new type of emotional literacy and a space where things could be discussed. And I think, there will have been people who found it definitely comforting. And I don't know the ingredients lists of that product, but I think it was pretty much like, a placebo. I mean, there's not really much in it. I mean, it's cod liver oil or something. I mean, it's not dangerous in that sense. It's not like the pharmaceuticals of today. And so I think it was possibly kind of harmless. It might not have done much good, but I don't think it did much to hurt. So I think I wouldn't be as, I think things have gone in a rather different direction in the modern day than where it started. But yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think there were 3 around here, so.
Mr. Lucas referred to it as the war of nerves. Was it, from his perspective, a negative? Or was he just observing it? Because from my perspective, it's, my God, how could you not be a nervous wreck? Because look at what happened and look what was happening in Germany at the time. So war of nerves, to me, would be the logical thing for people to have gone through it.
He was experiencing it.
Yeah.
That's what he was doing. And he was sharing that experience with his readers.
Did he think, gosh, we shouldn't be this way? Or did he understand?
Well, I think there was I think he thought it was very helpful to have the insights of psychoanalysis to have a greater understanding. Of course, he's a literary critic as well, and he, I think he finds it a very helpful analytical tool and framework. But yeah, obviously there's a remorse about it, he feels there's no way out of this. He hopes and prays there will be, but yeah, he's not celebrating it. No, he's observing it. He's diagnosing it in himself, and then projecting that onto the public or and to the larger world, or having that done for him.
Yeah, I was curious. I was curious, this is a very interdisciplinary kind of subject, like the history of emotions, and I know that for instance, in historical sociology, there's all different kinds of frameworks and approaches for which to talk about past societies. So I was curious in terms of I don't know what field would be most applicable to this, but maybe I don't know, social psychology or something I don't know, but what are the different approaches that one could take to researching this, and which one did you take, and what do you find? I mean, I guess that's a big question, but what do you find problematic about other approaches to researching the history of emotions?
Thanks. Yeah, it is a big question. I think I'm a little bit of a kind of a smorgasbord approach in terms of methods. I'll use what works at the moment, and it's about merging and bringing together and converging different methods and looking through a kaleidoscope of lenses. Really, is probably the way to put it. But I'm very interested. I'm using these techniques to study the history of these techniques. So I think that needs to be, and this discipline. So what emerges in the the 20s and the 30s is a new field called medical psychology. So it's generally it's allied to psychoanalysis, but it's also its own kind of thing. It's trying to establish itself, establish an expertise. It has its practitioners, and it is institutionalized. It has institutional status. There are increasingly roles within hospitals for medical psychologists. They will be usually people who have a medical degree to start with, and then become interested. It's kind of separate but related to psychiatry. So I think it's interesting I'm interested in how they, these practitioners, these originators and theorists or innovators in this field describe themselves, and try. And again, these are all techniques which are immediately applied to the social. So they are meant to be therapeutic and about helping individuals, but they can't resist. And I have a whole cohort of these medical psychologists, Edward Glover and so forth. And of course, Freud himself, Civilization and Its Discontents. They are eager very quickly to use these individuated therapeutic techniques and project them onto the collective. And they do that, I think, poetically it's beautiful. Obviously, in terms of actual science, it falls apart in lots of ways.
So would you describe what you were doing more as a history of psychiatric science?
It's one element of it, of course, because as Dan mentioned, one of the key streams of my project is a history of suicide. So I am interested both in the experience, but also the way that suicide was pathologized, understood, diagnosed. The legal framework of suicide. Suicide is illegal, which seems kind of pointless, but it's not decriminalized until 1961. So there's all kinds of, but I'm looking at around the discourses and around the kind of public responses and the to that, and to ultimately the a strong element of or lack of judgment in favor of greater compassion and understanding. And what brings that compassion and understanding on the part of coroners, government, family members, those who are affected by individual suicides, is the fact that what's going on all around everyone is this nervous state. So there's real understanding and empathy, I guess we'd call it, with, that rather than judgment or assuming that, people have kind of buckled to their own internal weaknesses. There's a real kind of understanding and relatable, there's a real, sense of relatableness to these kind of choices. And Lucas himself, I did use one of the quotes there where he says that, very clearly, who couldn't be thinking about suicide right now, and he doesn't follow through on that, thank goodness. But it's clear that it's on people's minds, and that they feel not, again, it's a social problem rather than an individual psychiatric one. Sorry.
Mine's a completely different question, almost kind of about it in understatement, but I know this isn't your field, and I only tangentially know this thing through osmosis, but you said something about jitterbug, and it made me think of the 1930s dance. Was that making fun of this situation at large? And I know there's been some psychologically research about dancing improving emotion, improving how we feel about ourselves through active movement, and it can be kind of a form of therapy.
Right.
Was this a way of coping, or was that just no relation to this time period whatsoever? Well,
usually jitterbugs were women, or they were accused of being jitterbugs. People who were so worried that they were ultimately, paralyzed with fear and couldn't, contribute to society. So it was a very negative, diagnosis or imposition on someone's state of mind and state of health. The fact that, there's lots of popular dances at the time which are interestingly interwoven with the political. The big dance craze at this moment is the Lambeth Walk, which and again, it's used so there's lots of intertextuality in that. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but in terms of, there's a lot of research on, again, the embodiment of psychological, illness or psychiatric illness. So in that sense, I think, Maybe that's kind of what you're suggesting, that.
Yeah, I'm just asking if they're tangentially related.
Yeah.
Or if that's.
Well, insofar as these are products of popular culture, which people immediately relate to. So if you say that person's a jitterbug, they know immediately what it's referring to, and it just becomes part of the vocabulary of the time, I think. Thanks. Yeah.
I'm going to ask a question. I love this talk. It was really
Thank you.
Insightful and helpful, and loved it.
Thank you.
And I wanted to step back to the beginning where you're talking about periodization, and I think you're challenging both the name of this period and the idea of periodization. So I just wonder, I'm thinking about the way you framed it as starting with the Munich crisis, and how you're thinking about what we as literary scholars would talk about the anxiety of the age in the 30s and even earlier. Wolf is already talking about it in 36. I have a colleague who wrote a book called Tense Future. Who wants
So what, sorry?
Tense Future.
Okay, Tense Future, thank you, yeah.
Who wants to talk about pre-traumatic stress
Right.
as characterizing the whole interwar period. So I'm just wondering, does this start at Munich, or?
No, I mean, that's a really important question. No, of course it doesn't come out of nowhere. It is a gradual evolution and accumulation of experience, of self-understanding, of applying and mainstreaming these concepts to everyday life and to ordinary people rather than just to elites. No, it doesn't come out of nowhere, but this seems to be the kind of the bursting out of this, it's the culmination. of this kind of this era of nerves. And indeed, that's, the first chapter of the book will be about, I have a title for the chapter, I haven't written it yet, but it's from shell shock to Tavistock, which is, I think, nice alliterative title. So, the Tavistock Clinic is established right after the war, mainly to study shell shock, and very quickly they are really, and the practitioners become very, popular, and there's a lot of interest. They do a lot of fundraising, and politicians become interested and involved. So it is very, what is surprising, and again, and that's I think one of my kind of probably bigger points, is to work against this notion of stiff upper lippery, of emotional illiteracy on the part of the British, and to say, well, no, actually we have a lot of evidence that people were not only feeling things, but they were able to articulate those feelings, and those feelings could be, the way that they were articulating them was both an expression of the depths of despair and anxiety, but also a therapeutic method ultimately. And of course, when you're looking at suicide rates, there is a little a little peak in 1938, which I think I'm helping to explain, but the big peak, of course, is during the Great Depression. So in terms of the understanding that mental illness is socially triggered, socioeconomically, politically triggered, there is a real kind of public understanding and acceptance of that. Is that?
Yeah,
okay,
excellent.
okay, thanks.
So I'm a German historian, and coincidentally I just finished reading a pamphlet devoted to German women in 1944, telling them how to avoid being jitterbugs and how to avoid spreading fear.
Right.
This is very much the part of the war when bombs are actually falling, so things are actually happening in this portion of the war. But one portion of this pamphlet I found very striking was talking about this war on the nerves of German women being a British tactic.
Oh, wow.
So
We need to talk.
They're saying that this is a tactic that the British have used since the Boer War.
Right.
But I wonder if this, the experience of living through this war of nerves contributes to the way that Britain prosecutes the war. I think about strategic bombing, Bomber Harris, these sorts of ideas that that targeted bombing can lead to a collapse, a sort of psychological collapse
Yeah.
of the German home front. So I mean,
It's all about morale, isn't it, ultimately? Yeah.
This may be outside your ken in this project, but I'm curious about this connection. It seems too coincidental to be anything other.
Yes, and again, I think it's really fascinating that they're throwing the same accusations at each other, because the British are saying that the German war tactics are a war of nerves, psyops, and essentially, and obviously by 1944, the Germans are feeling that the British have caught up, at least in that sense. Yeah. So, and of course, the great difference is, talking about mass observation and public opinion polling, there are a number of attempts to see how to manage these collective nervous disorders within the context of a democracy, which is very, very different and seen to be opposite. And the whole point of doing these, of innovating and using and developing these new political technologies is as a firewall against totalitarianism and against dictatorship. So, but ultimately, the boundaries are not as, unbreachable as they're often portrayed as. But thank you. Are you going to have to send me that? I'll take that. I'll steal that from you. I'll give you something in return. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. This was a wonderful talk. And I think it's really important, for young people to hear that people in the past thought that they were living in a time when the world was going to end, right? That is something that we feel, that's how people in the 17th century felt too, right? So it reminds us that our mental state and our emotions when we're going through something, can really also affect how we think about those things and such. But I actually had another question about gender, so which is a little different from Brian's, but Nerves and nervousness had always been attributed to women, especially in the Victorian period, right? Is this an example of nerves and nervousness becoming a nationwide problem, and therefore, is there some sense of feminization, or is that what we're seeing?
And that's a really good way of looking at it, because ultimately, going back to my second book, Guilty Women, the whole, the images and the narratives that were spun, the gendering of political narratives and appeasement is a feminine policy. And ultimately, Chamberlain is feminized as a result, and he's not doing the manly thing. He's not standing up to Hitler. I'm going to simplify things a little bit, but and in that sense, the fact that the whole nation is being susceptible to is subsuming to, or what's the word I'm looking for? Help me. Is succumbing. Sorry, gosh, I lost it. Is succumbing to this nervous disorder is a sign of, and again, and Lucas says that too. This is the end of civilization. We don't have, that this is a society in decline. This is a civilization in decline. And the fact that, it's not a celebration that we are so in touch with our emotions. We've lost it. And we're going to lose it. And the fact is that our nation is not ready. This is part of the unpreparedness for war that is often cited. So Harold Nicholson, who is an anti-appeaser, but and a big public figure, and is a lot on the BBC, and he talks a lot about this emotional inflammation of the Munich crisis, and he doesn't see that in a positive way at all. He sees this as the great flaw, the Achilles heel of the nation, and that they're going to lose because they're not ready. They're not ready psychologically, let alone in terms of defenses. So it's actually, not a celebration. It is part of the anxiety of the weakness and the indefense. The way that democracy is not ready to defend itself.
So the stiff upper lip is still the ideal, but it's just not the reality.
Exactly. Yes, it is. It is the ideal, and certainly, but then there is this. There's this blending of kind of newer notions of masculinity, that have emerged and evolved a lot from the height of empire. And you see that in the way that psychoanalysis and psychoanalytical terms and men's interest in psychoanalysis says something about the kind of greater flexibility. And don't forget that, and I pointed out that Lucas wasn't a pacifist, but so many men were, and it was, that was a real challenge to the hegemonic notions of masculinity, and they would often turn to, they were more feeling creatures. They were like women in being feeling creatures, and they wanted to be able to justify that. By 1938, there are fewer and fewer of them because so many pacifists kind of see the light and realize that you can't fight both fascism and defend peace. And Lucas didn't have to go there because he was never, a pacifist. But it actually goes the other way in that he realizes that, for his own personal interest, war is going to be, really dangerous. Whereas ethically and strategically, he's all for doing what needs to be done to defeat the Nazis. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting moment of transition, and a questioning and a breaking down of hegemonic notions of masculinity, which then, feed into, constructions of masculinity during the war itself, where it become, again, you have a probably a more elastic and more forgiving idea of what men should do and how they should feel. And again, if you look at psychiatry during the war, and the I didn't talk about that, but there's also a whole kind of effort for psychiatric preparation for the war and for psychiatric first aid, as we would call it now. And actually, everyone thinks that all the medical psychologists and all the social psychiatrists and all and the government itself thinks that the whole nation's going to absolutely, completely break down as soon as bombing starts, because that's what everyone is so afraid of. And they're not only afraid of bombing, but of a gas war. And what is really interesting is that kind of panic never actually happens. And all these preparations, these preparations for the psychiatric casualties of the war, there are very few of them compared to what people were expecting.
So the stiff upper lip then comes back once the war starts in earnest.
I guess so. But also what happens, of course, it's not the kind of war they thought it would be. I mean, the Blitz is horrible, but it's not a gas war at least, right? So, you know, their worst fears are not realized. The dystopian idea of what this war will be, that it will be gas war on civilians, that doesn't happen, at least in Britain.
If we can have one more question, I think, we think we're gonna have to call it quits after that.
So you kind of just touched on this, but with this more widespread like acceptance of like emotional and mental distress, was there like an actual rise in like more social programming and like help for like mental illness or mental disabilities? Like was there like maybe reforms within like psychiatric care, and like how was that affected by that?
Yeah, really good question, and that's all happening. There's this kind of institutionalization. There's this, establishment of clinics, of chairs, of positions in universities and hospitals to start, making this kind of care more widely available. And then you have, these kind of cutting-edge new medical psychologists who are saying to the government, "We want to be involved. We're really afraid of what's going to happen. Let us help you prepare." There's a big psychiatric hospital in the ready to deal with the psychiatric casualties of war, and it's never needed. Kind of like the Nightingale Center, if anyone followed the British preparations for the global pandemic. They go to all this effort, they build this, and they never, for whatever reason, have any patients. So it's kind of similar to that. So yeah, I think the fear outstrips the need, ultimately. And I don't know if I have an answer to why that is. That's probably what I need to figure out at some point.
Thank you. I think I want to give our thanks.
Thank you.